In the nascent stages of 1942, American aviators engaging Japanese Zero fighters over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean returned to their bases with accounts so astonishing they bordered on tall tales. Yet the gravity of their experiences was undeniably somber. These pilots recounted confrontations with an adversary aircraft possessing unparalleled agility, capable of executing maneuvers that surpassed the capabilities of any fighter fielded by the United States Navy or Army Air Forces. The Mitsubishi A6M0, known colloquially as the Zero, was not merely an effective combat machine. It was an instrument of terrifying proficiency, a fact underscored by the escalating casualties among American air crews. A stark illustration of this aerial dominance unfolded on February 20, 1942, during the inaugural Japanese aerial assault on Darwin, Australia. A formation of 9 Zeros, providing escort for a bomber contingent, encountered a hastily scrambled squadron of P-40 Warhawks. The resulting engagement was brief, concluding within minutes. The Zeros achieved a decisive victory, downing 4 P-40s without sustaining any losses themselves. Surviving American pilots consistently reported a vexing pattern. Every attempt to match the Zero's turn radius to acquire a firing solution proved futile. The Japanese fighter effortlessly tightened its arc, slipped inside their turning envelope, and invariably positioned itself squarely on their tail. The experience was akin to attempting to outmaneuver a nimble ballerina while encumbered by cumbersome leaden boots. The statistical data emerging from those initial months painted a grim picture. From the contested skies over the Philippines and Wake Island to the sprawling territories of the Dutch East Indies, American fighter pilots confronted a fundamental aerodynamic disadvantage. The Zero could execute a complete 360-degree turn in approximately 16 seconds at combat speeds. In contrast, the F-4F Wildcat, the United States' primary carrier-based fighter, required roughly 19 seconds to perform the same maneuver. The P-40 Warhawk demanded an even longer duration. While a difference of 3 seconds might appear negligible in isolation, within the crucible of a turning dogfight, those precious seconds were decisive. They afforded the Zero the opportunity to complete its turn, establish a firing solution, and unleash its devastating 20 mm cannon rounds into an American cockpit. All while the American pilot was still struggling to bring their aircraft's nose to bear on an empty patch of sky. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription, but raw numerical comparisons only illuminate a fraction of the narrative. The Zero's extraordinary turning capabilities were the direct result of a radical design philosophy. Japanese aeronautical engineers conceived an aircraft that tipped the scales at a mere 5,300 pounds empty, a weight approximately 2/3 that of an F-4F Wildcat. This remarkable weight reduction was achieved by systematically eliminating nearly all protective armor for the pilot and fuel tanks. The Zero lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and featured only minimal armored plating behind the pilot's seat. In essence, the Zero was a potent engine encased in a fragile airframe, a deliberate trade-off of pilot survivability for unadulterated maneuverability. American pilots, though unaware of these specific design compromises, acutely experienced their dire consequences. Almost every aerial engagement adhered to a dishearteningly predictable sequence. American pilots would detect approaching Zeros, initiate a high-speed dive to attack, perhaps manage a brief burst of gunfire, and then the Zeros would respond by initiating their own turn to engage. the moment an American pilot attempted to enter a turning fight, to maneuver their aircraft in a horizontal circular pattern to track the enemy. They were irrevocably lost. The Zero would effortlessly outturn them, seamlessly transitioning from a defensive posture to an offensive one within seconds. Experienced pilots developed a profound sense of dread as they pulled back on the control stick, knowing they were committing to a contest they were destined to lose. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley encapsulated the gravity of the situation in March 1942, following a series of engagements near Guadalcanal. He articulated, "It's not that our boys lack courage or skill. They have both in abundance. But they're trying to fight by the rules, and the rules don't work anymore. We're teaching them to dogfight, to turn and burn, to stay in the fight against Zeros. That's teaching them to die." His poignant words resonated deeply, cutting to the very core of the existential crisis confronting American naval aviation. The entire doctrine of fighter combat, meticulously developed over years of rigorous training and theoretical analysis, had been rendered obsolete in a mere matter of weeks. The ramifications of this crisis extended far beyond the immediate survival of individual pilots. Achieving air superiority in the Pacific theater was contingent upon prevailing in these critical fighter-versus-fighter engagements. If American fighters proved incapable of safeguarding dive bombers and torpedo planes, then carrier task forces would be unable to execute effective strikes against Japanese targets. Conversely, if fighters could not protect vital bases and bomber formations, America's offensive capacity would effectively vanish. The Zero problem was not merely a tactical challenge in aerial combat. It posed a direct threat to the entire strategic framework of the Pacific theater. Pilots began to refer to it as Zero Fever, that chilling moment of clarity in a turning engagement with a Japanese fighter, when the stark realization dawned that the enemy would complete his turn before you could. Some pilots succumbed to paralysis in the face of this overwhelming disadvantage. Others resorted to desperate, ill-advised maneuvers that only exacerbated their perilous situation. However, a select few began to approach the problem with a different mindset, and these individuals started to discern intriguing patterns in the Zero's operational behavior. Commander John Smith Thatch, universally known as Jimmy, found himself grappling with a persistent problem that deprived him of sleep aboard the USS Lexington in early 1942. As the commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 3, he bore the profound responsibility of preserving the lives of his pilots as they confronted an enemy aircraft that demonstrably outclassed their Wildcats in virtually every quantifiable metric. Thatch was an unconventional naval officer for his era. He was not content merely to fly, he was a dedicated student of aerial combat. While many of his fellow squadron commanders focused primarily on gunnery practice and precision formation flying, Thatch dedicated countless hours to meticulously poring over after-action reports, conducting in-depth debriefings with returning pilots, and meticulously performing calculations on scraps of paper. By April 1942, Thatch had amassed sufficient data to clearly discern the emerging pattern. American pilots who managed to survive encounters with Zeros shared common experiences. They consistently described how the Zero pilot would relentlessly lock onto a target and pursue it through a turning engagement with an almost preternatural precision. The Japanese pilots, acutely aware of their aircraft's superior turning capabilities, would commit fully to the turn, relentlessly tightening their radius and enduring higher G-forces, confident that their quarry would exhaust its turning performance first. This unwavering confidence, Thach realized, had become a predictable element of their tactics, and predictability, he reasoned, could be exploited. Thach also observed another critical detail during the debriefings, a detail that most other officers tended to dismiss as a byproduct of combat stress or muddled recollections. Multiple pilots reported that when they attempted radical maneuvers, sudden, unexpected dives, abrupt climbs, or aggressive reductions in throttle, Zero pilots occasionally appeared momentarily surprised. The Japanese aviators had grown accustomed to American pilots engaging in a particular, predictable manner, maintaining speed, attempting to turn, and ultimately perishing. Any deviation from this established pattern seemed to momentarily disorient the enemy. These were fleeting moments, typically insufficient to save a pilot's life, but they were moments nonetheless. The pivotal breakthrough occurred when Thach extensively interviewed Lieutenant Edward "Butch" O'Hare, following his extraordinary performance on February 20th, 1942. O'Hare had single-handedly defended the Lexington against a formation of 9 Japanese bombers, successfully shooting down 5. However, what truly captivated Thach's attention was not the bombers themselves, but rather O'Hare's ingenious approach to dealing with the escorting Zeros. O'Hare described executing high-speed slashing attacks, delivering a burst of gunfire, and then steadfastly refusing to engage in a turning fight. Instead, he leveraged his Wildcat's superior diving speed to disengage, rapidly zooming back up to altitude, converting that speed into potential energy, and then initiating another attack. Crucially, he never allowed a Zero to lure him into a protracted turning engagement. Thach began to conduct tactical experiments using simple matchsticks on his desk, pushing 2 matchsticks around to simulate various tactical approaches. The core problem was one of isolation. If a Zero secured a position on your tail and you were unable to outturn it, your fate was sealed. But what if you were not alone? What if your wingman could be transformed into a weapon? He manipulated the matchsticks in crossing patterns, deliberately creating scenarios where a Zero pursuing one Wildcat would inevitably fly directly into the firing arc of another. The underlying geometry was remarkably straightforward, yet its successful execution demanded impeccable coordination and an unwavering trust between pilots. On May 10, 1942, Thach assembled his squadron pilots in the Lexington's ready room and meticulously explained the innovative tactic he had devised. He christened it the beam defense position, although it would forever be enshrined in history as the Thach weave. The concept was nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of engaging individually, 2 Wildcats would fly parallel courses, maintaining a separation of approximately 200 feet. When a Zero initiated an attack on one of the planes, both Wildcats would simultaneously turn toward each other in a coordinated crisscross pattern. The Zero, having committed to pursuing the first Wildcat through its turn, would suddenly find the second Wildcat crossing directly in front of its nose, guns blazing. If the Zero broke off its attack to avoid being shot down, the first Wildcat was safely disengaged. Conversely, if the Zero continued its pursuit, it would fly directly into a devastating hail of .50 caliber bullets. However, Thach was developing more than just this ingenious weave. He was meticulously documenting something far more fundamental about Zero tactics. Japanese pilots, he observed, had developed predictable patterns of engagement rooted in their aircraft's inherent superiority. They anticipated American pilots to fight in specific, conventional ways, to turn, to attempt dogfighting, to adhere to rules that inherently favored the Zero. This ingrained expectation, Thach realized, created a form of tunnel vision. Zero pilots would commit to a pursuit with such unwavering confidence that they would often overlook critical warning signs. They would follow American fighters into situations that a more cautious or discerning pilot would immediately recognize as potential traps. Thach diligently shared his invaluable observations with every squadron commander who was willing to listen. He drafted detailed tactical memoranda that were circulated throughout the fleet. While some of his groundbreaking ideas were initially dismissed by senior officers who had never personally confronted a Zero and who believed Thach was needlessly overcomplicating established fighter tactics, the pilots who had survived the harrowing combat in the South Pacific devoured Thach's reports as if they were sacred scripture. Here was an individual who genuinely understood the formidable challenges they faced and who was systematically developing practical solutions rather than merely demanding greater courage or improved gunnery skills. The ultimate litmus test for these revolutionary tactics would soon arrive at Midway. I am from a small town in the Midwest, and I find the topic of early World War II air combat absolutely fascinating. The ingenuity and courage of pilots like Thach, who were able to analyze a seemingly insurmountable problem and devise a tactical solution that saved countless lives, is truly inspiring. It highlights how critical analytical thinking and adaptive strategies are in the face of overwhelming odds. The true crucible for this revolutionary concept would inevitably manifest itself at Midway. The Thach weave, when merely conceptualized on paper, presented an inherently counterintuitive and seemingly preposterous notion. Established principles of naval aerial combat, dating back to the Great War, steadfastly emphasized the critical importance of maintaining cohesive flight formations, offering collective protection via circular defensive maneuvers, and relying on individual pilots' skill in close-quarters aerial duels. Yet here was Thach, instructing his airmen to intentionally vector their aircraft into the path of an approaching adversary, to execute swift, intersecting trajectories with their comrades at high velocities, and to place their faith in precise spatial relationships and impeccable synchronization, rather than relying on the inherent maneuverability advantages of their aircraft or a foe's. This radical departure flew in the face of deeply ingrained intuitions and challenged foundational tenets that fighter pilots had cultivated throughout their careers. Commander Thach subjected his airmen to an intense and unyielding training regimen during the transoceanic journey towards the pivotal Pacific Atoll. During the concluding days of May 1942, two Grumman F-4F Wildcats would repeatedly rehearse the intricate, intersecting, scissoring movement, converging on one another, executing a swift pass, then reversing course to intersect once more. This repetitive pattern forged an interlocking protective envelope, an aerial shield virtually impenetrable to a lone attacking aircraft. However, its flawless execution demanded unerring accuracy. If the synchronization deviated by mere fractions of a moment, the two Wildcats risked catastrophic mid-air impact. Should one pilot display any indecision or error in their estimation of the critical intersection, the intricate defensive pattern disintegrated, leaving both fighter planes exposed to enemy fire. Thach's pilots practiced until this complex aerial ballet became an inherent reflex, until they could perform it flawlessly even amidst the chaos of combat, with their physiological responses heightened and their limbs trembling from the intense pressure. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this insightful video. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from, and your thoughts on the crucial topic discussed in this video. On June 4, 1942, the monumental Battle of Midway provided the crucial proving ground for this untested doctrine. Commander Thach personally spearheaded his flight of 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcats, tasked with providing protective cover for the torpedo bombers attacking the Imperial Japanese naval aircraft carriers. Precisely at Aero 920 hours, a formidable aerial onslaught of A-6M-0s descended upon the American formation. Thach witnessed his gravest fears rapidly becoming a terrifying reality. A formidable force exceeding 12 Zeros aggressively descending upon his significantly outmatched Wildcat squadron. Without hesitation, he instantly initiated the intricate Thach weave maneuver alongside his loyal wingman, Ensign Robert Ramdib. An enemy Zero fighter rapidly secured a position directly behind Thach's aircraft, pursuing him into the turn with an anticipated level of unyielding ferocity. The Japanese pilot was executing his attack precisely in line with Thach's prior analytical predictions, wholeheartedly dedicated to the chase, possessing unwavering certainty in his fighter's superior maneuverability, and singularly fixated on the American aircraft directly ahead. Dib crossed in front of Thach at a combined converging velocity, approaching an astonishing 500 miles per hour. The unsuspecting Japanese pilot abruptly discovered his aircraft positioned squarely within Dib's targeting reticle, affording him a mere 2-second window to respond. Dib's formidable array of 650 caliber heavy machine guns unleashed a torrent of fire, utterly tearing apart the Zero's lightly armored fuselage. The enemy fighter was utterly obliterated. Thach instantaneously executed a sharp reversal of his turn, skillfully recrossing Dib's aerial trajectory. A second Zero, which had been relentlessly hounding Dib, now encountered an identical geometric predicament. Thach's formidable armament was now aimed squarely at the approaching adversary. The Japanese pilot swiftly abandoned his attack, evidently unwilling to confront an unavoidable demise. Within a mere half-minute, this ingenious defensive tactic had accounted for the destruction of 1 Zero and compelled a second to retreat from the engagement. The aerial skirmish persisted for a duration approaching 20 intense minutes. Commander Thach's squadron maintained their intricate weaving maneuvers, persistently crossing paths and consistently turning into one another's flight paths, rather than attempting evasive action outwards. The Japanese Zeros, long accustomed to effortlessly dispatching lone or disorganized American aircraft, found themselves utterly unable to penetrate the cohesive defensive pattern. With each committed assault, an enemy fighter inevitably plunged into a deadly converging hail of bullets from multiple angles. Japanese aviators, whose confidence had been bolstered by the perceived predictability of American aerial tactics, were abruptly confronted with an unprecedented and perplexing challenge. A portion of the enemy pilots demonstrated adaptability, disengaging from the assault, while others, rigidly committed to their initial attack strategies, pressed on only to meet their demise. By the time Thach's division made their way back to the aircraft carrier Yorktown, they had achieved confirmed destruction of 3 enemy Zeros and successfully repelled the attacks of no fewer than 5 additional adversaries. More importantly, they had crucially safeguarded the vulnerable torpedo bombers for a sufficient duration to allow their offensive operation to commence, notwithstanding the fact that the torpedo assault ultimately yielded limited results owing to a confluence of unrelated strategic difficulties. News of this innovative and effective weaving maneuver rapidly disseminated throughout the entire Pacific Fleet within a mere handful of days. Aviators who had previously harbored a sense of vulnerability and inadequacy when confronting the superior Zero fighters now possessed a tangible and proven defensive strategy that demonstrably achieved its objective. However, the weave symbolized a paradigm shift, far exceeding the utility of a mere ingenious, tactical innovation. It profoundly transformed the philosophical underpinnings of American fighter-pilot engagement strategies. The previous tenets of aerial warfare placed paramount importance on the individual pilot's dexterity and the inherent capabilities of their aircraft. The emerging philosophy, in contrast, underscored the critical roles of coordinated group effort, stringent adherence to strategic principles, and the astute manipulation of adversary psychological tendencies. It became clear that directly outmaneuvering a Zero was unnecessary if one could intellectually outwit the Japanese pilot. Consequently, fighter units across the vast expanse of the Pacific theater commenced tailoring the weave to suit their specific operational requirements. Certain adaptations incorporated 4 aircraft instead of the original pair, thereby generating even more intricate and formidable intersecting aerial designs. Others adjusted the precise timing and spatial separation according to the distinct flight characteristics of the Grumman Wildcats, Curtiss P-40s, or the newly deployed Lockheed P-38 Lightnings that were progressively entering service within the operational zone. Nevertheless, the fundamental tenet persisted unchanged. Initiate a turn towards your fellow pilot. Compel the adversary to make a critical decision between disengaging or confronting direct gunfire, and consistently refuse to engage in combat on terms anticipated by the enemy. The repercussions on the morale and combat approach of Japanese aviators were profound. Reports gleaned from intercepted enemy communications and the questioning of captured personnel brought to light that by the latter half of 1942, Zero pilots had adopted a notably more circumspect posture in aerial engagements. The era of effortless triumphs experienced during the initial months of 1942 had decisively concluded. American flight configurations employing the intricate weaving and scissoring patterns presented a threat whose potency transcended mere numerical superiority. The inherent tactical superiority of the Japanese, specifically their aircraft's exceptional agility, had been effectively negated, not by advancements in aircraft design or technological prowess, but by the application of superior strategic intellect. While Commander Thatch's innovative weave effectively provided a solution for defensive maneuvers, when an enemy Zero successfully gained a superior position behind one's aircraft, it left unanswered a more profound and persistent query that continued to trouble American fighter pilots. Specifically, how could one proactively engage an adversary whose aircraft possessed superior turning capabilities without first being subjected to their initial assault? The solution, surprisingly, originated from an unexpected quarter, from those aviators who had managed to endure combat by entirely abstaining from traditional close-quarters dogfighting. These resourceful individuals had inadvertently discovered a principle that would evolve into the foundational element of American fighter doctrine for the remainder of the conflict: the concept of energy fighting. In August of 1942, Major John L. Smith, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 223, touched down at the embattled Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. He brought with him a straightforward yet revolutionary combat philosophy, which he meticulously instilled into the consciousness of every pilot serving under his authority. The stark declaration that altitude is life, speed is life-turning is death. Major Smith had undertaken an exhaustive and meticulous examination of the initial combat analyses and arrived at a strategic determination that, to aviators steeped in conventional dogfighting traditions, might have appeared almost timid or unheroic. This core tenet was to absolutely abstain from engaging in turning maneuvers with a zero, irrespective of the combat scenario. Rather, his airmen were instructed to capitalize on the singular inherent superiority of their American aircraft, their exceptional diving velocity, and robust structural integrity. The underlying physical principles were remarkably uncomplicated. A fully provisioned Wildcat fighter tipped the scales at approximately 7,900 pounds, a stark contrast to the Zero's comparatively lighter 5,300 pounds. When engaged in horizontal flight at identical velocities, both aircraft possessed equivalent kinetic energy. However, during a vertical descent, the significantly heavier Wildcat gained speed more rapidly and was capable of attaining much greater velocities before encountering its inherent structural limitations. The Zero's celebrated lightweight construction, the very attribute that endowed it with such remarkable agility in turns, paradoxically transformed into a considerable disadvantage during aggressive vertical maneuvers. Japanese pilots who initiated overly vigorous dives ran the serious risk of subjecting their aircraft's airframes to excessive and damaging stresses. Conversely, American aviators piloting Wildcats, P-40s, and particularly the robust Republic P-47 Thunderbolts that subsequently entered service could execute dives at speeds that were sufficient to cause the structural disintegration of a Zero. Major Smith's aviators perfected and employed a combat methodology that soon acquired the moniker boom and zoom attacks. These pilots would maintain patrol at elevated altitudes, typically at or above 20,000 feet, thereby preserving what fighter pilots termed an energy advantage over potential adversaries. Upon identifying enemy Zeros beneath their position, they would initiate a rapid, high-speed dive, unleash a concentrated burst of gunfire at their intended target, and then leverage their accumulated diving speed to swiftly climb back to their advantageous altitude before the Zeros had an opportunity to effectively respond. Each offensive pass was executed in a matter of mere seconds. Should their concentrated gunfire find its mark, the Zero was invariably destroyed. Conversely, if the initial burst failed to connect, the American pilot would not linger to assess the outcome. Instead, he would efficiently convert his gained velocity back into potential energy, regaining altitude and positioning himself for a subsequent attack run. The Zeros below, despite their vaunted turning capabilities, could engage in all the evasive maneuvers they desired. They were simply incapable of intercepting an aircraft that steadfastly declined to engage them on their preferred terms of combat. Captain Joe Foss, who would ultimately conclude the global conflict distinguished as one of America's most celebrated aces, credited with 26 aerial triumphs, succinctly articulated the principles of energy fighting doctrine with remarkable candor during a post-mission briefing held in November 1942. He declared with unambiguous clarity that the Zero's primary objective is to entice you into a turning engagement that is its specialized domain. Therefore, refuse to participate in that particular contest. He continued, maintain a superior altitude. Preserve your velocity. Strike your adversary when he is unaware, and withdraw before he has any chance to react effectively. This approach is not predicated on demonstrating raw courage or proving one's aerial superiority in a symmetrically matched engagement. Its sole purpose is the elimination of the enemy and ensuring one's own safe return. Captain Foss's potent declaration encapsulated the profound reorientation of combat philosophy that was progressively permeating the entire Pacific theater of operations. The nuanced understanding of energy management extended far beyond the simplistic actions of merely ascending and descending. Aviators were educated to perceive their aircraft as dynamic repositories of energy, manifesting in two distinct but interchangeable forms: kinetic energy derived from velocity and potential energy attributed to altitude. Each aerial maneuver inherently either expended a portion of this energy reservoir or facilitated the conversion of one energy type into the other. For instance, a sudden, aggressive turn invariably resulted in a significant reduction of airspeed, effectively transforming kinetic energy into angular momentum and, through the dissipative forces of aerodynamic drag, into dissipated thermal energy. Conversely, an ascent traded kinetic energy for an increase in potential energy, while a dive accomplished the inverse exchange. The overarching objective was to consistently possess a greater aggregate energy state than one's adversary, a condition that inherently granted the pilot control over the parameters and initiation of any engagement. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, a figure who had previously voiced his strong dissatisfaction with the inherent shortcomings of conventional dogfighting methodologies, emerged as a prominent and impassioned proponent of the burgeoning energy fighting doctrine. By September of 1942, he had successfully devised a comprehensive training curriculum, utilizing didactic chalk talks and illustrative blackboard diagrams to instruct pilots in the crucial skill of visually apprehending and assessing energy states within the dynamic context of aerial combat. Flatley would frequently sketch two hypothetical aircraft scenarios, posing a direct question such as, imagine this. Zero is positioned at an altitude of 15,000 feet, maintaining a speed of 180 knots. You, in contrast, are at 20,000 feet, flying at 250 knots. Which aircraft possesses the discernible energy advantage? The invariable response emphasized that the aircraft possessing the greater aggregate energy, a combination of both kinetic and potential energy, was the one that held the strategic prerogative to dictate the terms of engagement, choosing either to initiate combat or to disengage as circumstances warranted. The critical decision of whether to engage in direct combat or execute a strategic retreat demanded a level of self-control that directly contradicted the inherent aggressive tendencies of a fighter pilot. When an aviator, having targeted a zero, executed a diving maneuver and failed to achieve a hit, their primal impulse was to immediately execute a tight turn and attempt another pass. After all, they had just descended 5,000 feet at an exhilarating velocity, their adversary remained within sight, and the act of re-engaging felt like the most natural course of action. However, such a turn would invariably dissipate all their accumulated speed, instantly placing them in the same energy state as the Zero, slow and perilously exposed. The Zero pilot, who moments before had been on the defensive, could then effortlessly reverse their roles, becoming the aggressor. History unequivocally demonstrated that pilots unable to resist this dangerous temptation often met a tragic end. The innovative throttle-down overshoot technique materialized from the crucible of desperate aerial encounters, where all other tactical options had been exhausted. This scenario typically involved the loss of a crucial altitude advantage, with a Zero having skillfully positioned itself on the tail of an American fighter, despite the latter's most strenuous evasive maneuvers. The thatch weave, a proven defensive tactic, was rendered impractical if a wingman was engaged in his own separate struggle. Energy fighting doctrine explicitly dictated that a pilot should never find themselves in such a precarious predicament. Yet the chaotic reality of combat frequently defied theoretical constructs in the most brutal fashion. It was in these dire circumstances that pilots serendipitously discovered that the throttle lever itself could be transformed into a potent weapon. Ensign James Swett inadvertently stumbled upon this groundbreaking technique on April 7, 1943, amidst a massive Japanese aerial offensive targeting Guadalcanal. A Zero had relentlessly pursued his aircraft after Swett had expended his advantages in both altitude and speed during a frenetic engagement with enemy dive bombers. Swett was furiously maneuvering his Wildcat through a series of violent turns, but the tenacious Zero pilot mirrored his every move, steadily closing the distance. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Swett's aircraft, already compromised and leaking hydraulic fluid, left him acutely aware that he had perhaps a mere 30 seconds before the Zero's devastating 20 mm cannons would shred his empennage. In a moment of sheer desperation, he executed a maneuver that defied every trained instinct. He abruptly pulled his throttle to the idle position. The effect was instantaneous and astonishingly dramatic. The Wildcat's sudden deceleration violently thrust Swett forward against the restraint of his shoulder harness. Behind him, the Zero pilot, meticulously tracking his target's speed and adjusting his own throttle to maintain a prime firing solution, was caught completely off guard. When Swett's aircraft abruptly lost speed, the Zero's inherent momentum carried it forward. In the lexicon of aerial combat, this phenomenon is known as an overshoot. The Zero flashed past Swett's left wing, instantly transitioning from the role of hunter to the hunted. Seizing the fleeting opportunity, Swett aggressively advanced his throttle, subtly elevated his nose, and unleashed a 2-second burst into the Zero's vulnerable underside as it momentarily hung exposed before him. The Japanese aircraft immediately rolled inverted and plunged catastrophically into the ocean below. The fundamental principles of physics underpinning the throttle-down overshoot are deeply rooted in the concepts of momentum and human reaction time. An aircraft hurtling through the air at 280 mph traverses approximately 410 feet every single second. When a pursuing pilot observes his target undergo a sudden and unexpected deceleration, a precise sequence of events unfolds. Initially, there is a recognition lag. The human brain typically requires around half a second to fully register that the target's speed has undergone a significant alteration. This is then followed by a decision lag, an additional quarter second needed to formulate a response to this new information. Finally, an action lag occurs, representing the time required to physically manipulate the throttle or control stick. By the time the pursuing pilot has successfully reduced power and applied the appropriate back pressure to avert an overshoot, they have already inadvertently closed the distance by an additional 200 to 300 feet beyond their intended position. However, the effective application of this technique was considerably more nuanced than a simple, hopeful reduction of throttle. Pilots who survived long enough to refine the method discovered that precise timing and an acute sense of situational awareness were paramount. Reducing the throttle prematurely would allow the pursuing pilot ample time to adjust, simply slowing down in tandem, and thereby maintaining their advantageous firing position. Conversely, delaying the throttle reduction for too long, especially if the enemy was already within effective firing range, would merely transform the American aircraft into an easier target. The optimal moment for execution was when the pursuing aircraft was approximately 2 to 3 seconds away from achieving its ideal firing position, a proximity where the pilot's concentration was intensely focused on their gun sight and target tracking, rather than on broader maneuvering. Moreover, the successful deployment of this tactic necessitated a profound understanding of the pursuer's psychological state and tactical approach. By mid-1943, Zero pilots had developed highly specific attack patterns, honed through hundreds of successful engagements. Their typical methodology involved closing to within 200 feet, settling into a firing position slightly behind and below their target, and then unleashing a methodical burst aimed directly at the cockpit and engine. This consistent and predictable attack profile, born of confidence and repetition, rendered them exploitable. A Zero pilot who had committed himself to this precise killing shot had irrevocably committed his aircraft to a specific flight path and speed. He fully anticipated his target to either maintain its current speed or desperately attempt to accelerate. A sudden and unexpected deceleration was simply not an element within his established tactical playbook. Marine Captain Jefferson DeBlanc, an ace who achieved 9 aerial victories during the pivotal Guadalcanal campaign, vividly recounted teaching the throttle-down technique to newly arrived replacement pilots in early 1943. He instructed them to think of it like playing chicken, but in reverse. The Zero pilot believes he has already secured the victory. He is settling in for the kill. That very confidence renders him predictable. When you chop the throttle, you are essentially gambling that his momentum and his ingrained expectations will carry him past you before he can effectively react. It is undeniably an unsettling sensation. Your speed plummets, your controls become sluggish and unresponsive, and every primal instinct screams that you are making a grave error. But if your timing is impeccable, you gain a precious 1 or 2 seconds where he is momentarily in front of you, and crucially, you are still alive to fire your weapons. Nevertheless, the throttle-down maneuver possessed inherent limitations that pilots quickly discovered through the harsh realities of trial and error. It was fundamentally a one-time trick. Once executed, the aircraft had effectively bled off the majority of its airspeed and energy. If the pilot failed to capitalize on the opportunity presented by the enemy's overshoot, missing their shot, they found themselves in dire straits, slow, extremely vulnerable, and devoid of any energy reserve for further evasive action. Furthermore, the technique proved ineffective against multiple attackers. Time .2s. While 1-0 might be forced to overshoot, its wingman would simply adjust his approach and effortlessly shoot down the American aircraft during its low-speed recovery. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had unequivocally validated the effectiveness of Thach's weave under intense combat conditions. But it was the protracted struggle for Guadalcanal that truly became the proving ground where energy tactics and meticulous throttle management transcended from experimental concepts into established standard doctrine. Henderson Field, captured by tenacious Marines on August 7, 1942, became the epicenter of a brutal 6-month aerial meat grinder that pilots grimly referred to as the Slot. Japanese aircraft routinely streamed down from Rabaul on an almost daily basis, and American fighters launched from Henderson's muddy, shell-pocked runway to bravely intercept them. This was the unforgiving arena where theoretical combat principles repeatedly confronted the brutal, unyielding reality of war, violently and without mercy. Marine Fighting Squadron 223, under the astute leadership of Major John L. Smith, arrived at Henderson on August 20, 1942, equipped with 19 Wildcat fighters. Smith's pilots had undergone rigorous indoctrination in the fundamental principles of energy fighting long before their deployment to Guadalcanal. No turning with zeros. Maintain altitude, dive, shoot, climb. On August 24th, during the pivotal Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Smith's squadron successfully intercepted a formidable formation of Japanese bombers and their accompanying Zero escorts. The Marines judiciously maintained their high altitude, executed a blistering dive through the Zero screen at speeds exceeding 350 meters, destroying 4 bombers in their initial pass, and then rapidly zoomed back to altitude before the Zeros could mount an effective counter-response. The surviving Zero pilots futilely turned and twisted below, showcasing their superior maneuverability to an empty sky, while Smith's pilots calmly repositioned themselves for another devastating diving attack. The engagement statistics from those initial weeks at Guadalcanal painted a truly remarkable picture. In August 1942, Marine and Navy fighters operating from Henderson Field successfully shot down 42 Japanese aircraft, while incurring the loss of only 16 of their own, representing an impressive kill ratio of approximately 2.6 to 1. In stark contrast, the aerial combat witnessed in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies just 6 months prior had frequently seen ratios that favored the Japanese. The crucial difference was not superior aircraft. The Wildcats deployed at Guadalcanal were precisely the same models that had struggled earlier in the conflict. The decisive factor was tactics. American pilots were no longer fighting in a manner that played directly into the inherent strengths of the Zero's design. Captain Marion Carl, who earned the distinction of becoming the first Marine Corps ace at Guadalcanal, recounted a typical engagement on September 9, 1942. Which vividly illustrated how sophisticated throttle management had become seamlessly integrated into standard combat procedure. Carl had initiated an attack on a Zero from a superior altitude, executed his firing pass, and was in the process of climbing back to altitude when he observed that his speed had diminished more than he had intended. A second Zero had skillfully maneuvered into a position directly behind him during his climb. Carl judiciously continued his climb for an additional 3 seconds, meticulously monitoring his airspeed indicator as it steadily dropped from 210 to 180 knots, deliberately allowing the Zero to close the distance. Then, With precise timing, he simultaneously reduced his throttle to idle and deployed his landing flaps, a synchronized double deceleration that dramatically killed his airspeed. The Zero overshot with such violent momentum that it passed nearly 100 feet ahead of Carl's nose. Carl swiftly retracted his flaps, aggressively shoved his throttle forward, and decisively destroyed the Zero with a deflection shot as it desperately attempted to dive away. The Japanese naval aviators, far from being unintelligent or inflexible, quickly recognized that American tactics had undergone a significant evolution and made concerted efforts to adapt. By October 1942, Japanese fighter pilots operating over Guadalcanal began to fly higher and engage with significantly greater caution. Some even adopted slashing attacks remarkably similar to the American boom and zoom tactics. However, they confronted a fundamental and insurmountable problem. The Zero's design was meticulously optimized for exceptional turning performance at moderate speeds. When Zero pilots attempted to engage in energy battles at high speed and high altitude, they effectively surrendered the inherent advantages their aircraft provided without gaining any equivalent benefits in return. A Zero attempting to execute a boom and zoom maneuver was, at best, mediocre. A Wildcat, conversely, employing sophisticated energy tactics, was fully leveraging its actual inherent strengths. The tumultuous naval battle of Guadalcanal, unfolding over November 12th and 13th, 1942, served as a stark, compelling testament to the remarkable advancements in American fighter aviation strategies within a mere half-year. During this pivotal confrontation, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley expertly guided a combat air patrol comprising 8 F-4F Wildcats, as a formidable Japanese aerial assault bore down upon the waiting American fleet. Eschewing the conventional head-on charge into the enemy ranks, Flatley astutely maneuvered his squadron to a commanding position, a full 5,000 feet above the Japanese formation and strategically offset to their flank. This deliberate placement secured an undeniable advantage in both altitude and kinetic potential. His pilots, executing a series of methodical high-speed diving assaults, engaged the enemy bomber stream with precision, each Wildcat pilot completing a staggering 3 or 4 distinct boom and zoom passes. The accompanying Japanese A-6M-0 escorts, renowned for their agility, found themselves perpetually on the defensive, scrambling to react to the American onslaught instead of dictating the terms of engagement. By the conclusion of this intense aerial ballet, Flatley's highly effective division had successfully neutralized 7 enemy bombers and 2 Zeros, achieving this decisive victory without incurring the loss of a single friendly aircraft. As the year 1942 drew to a close, the upward trajectory in American kill ratios against Japanese aerial forces became even more unequivocally apparent. Across the crucial months of November and December, American fighter squadrons operating in the Solomon Islands theater consistently achieved unprecedented success, boasting an impressive combat ratio approaching 4-to-1 against their Japanese adversaries. This discernible shift in aerial dominance was corroborated by intelligence gathered from various sources, including meticulously analyzed captured Japanese operational documents and detailed interrogations of enemy prisoners of war. These invaluable insights painted a clear picture of an escalating respect tinged with genuine apprehension among the Japanese for the evolving American fighter methodologies. A particularly telling account emerged from a Japanese naval aviator, downed and subsequently apprehended in December 1942, who disclosed to his interrogators that Zero pilots had received explicit directives to steer clear of protracted dogfights with American fighters that held a superior altitude. His candid observation, delivered with a palpable sense of resignation, was that the Americans no longer fight foolishly, a stark admission of the profound tactical evolution witnessed on the Allied side. Ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Amidst the relentless crucible of combat, Henderson Field on Guadalcanal transformed organically into an impromptu tactical proving ground, a dynamic laboratory where groundbreaking, successful techniques were disseminated not through official channels, but via direct, invaluable pilot-to-pilot mentorship. Seasoned combat veterans, having honed their skills in the unforgiving skies, would conscientiously draw aside newly arrived aviators, patiently elucidating the precise mechanics of executing throttle-down overshoots, imparting the critical wisdom required to accurately assess an aircraft's energy state, and teaching them to instinctively discern when an enemy Zero pilot had irrevocably committed to an attack pattern. This vital knowledge, however, remained largely uncodified, a guerrilla doctrine born of immediate exigency. While the official training manuals back in the continental United States largely continued to advocate the outdated principles of traditional dogfighting, a radically different, more effective paradigm for aerial combat was being forged in the fiery crucible of the South Pacific, refined daily through the stark imperatives of necessity and the brutal lessons of survival. As the calendar turned to early 1943, both the United States Navy and Marine Corps became acutely aware of a burgeoning challenge, an advantageous predicament to be sure, yet a significant hurdle nonetheless. While their seasoned aviators in the Pacific Theater had, through arduous experience, forged exceptionally effective tactical approaches for engaging Japanese fighters, this invaluable combat wisdom resided predominantly within the personal mental repositories of combat veterans and lay dispersed across various, often disparate, after-action reports. A stark disconnect persisted. Newly minted pilots arriving directly from stateside training facilities were still being indoctrinated into the outdated paradigm of traditional dogfighting, encouraged to engage in turning contests with the enemy, and to place undue reliance on individual aerial combat prowess. The imperative became unequivocally clear. The Navy had to systematically institutionalize the hard-won lessons etched in blood over the skies of Guadalcanal, transforming these battlefield innovations into a cohesive and universally applicable training doctrine. It was the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida, that swiftly emerged as the crucible, the very epicenter, of this nascent tactical revolution, sweeping through fighter pilot instruction. In a move of profound foresight, Commander John Thatch, a name already synonymous with innovative aerial strategy, received orders in February 1943 to return from the Pacific Front with the express mandate to fundamentally overhaul and redesign the existing fighter training curriculum. Thatch arrived not empty-handed, but laden with a veritable treasure trove of empirical evidence, voluminous reams of meticulously compiled combat data, compelling gun camera footage capturing real-world engagements, and exhaustive debriefing transcripts from returning pilots. Yet perhaps even more invaluable than these tangible proofs, he carried the unassailable credibility of a combat commander who had not only conceived, but also personally proven tactics that unequivocally worked, tactics that demonstrably kept pilots alive amidst the chaos of aerial warfare. When Thatch articulated his insights, the assembled instructors, keenly aware of his bona fides, listened with rapt attention. And when he unequivocally declared that the prevailing traditional dogfighting training methods were, in essence, contributing to the needless loss of pilots, the United States Navy, with a newfound urgency, commenced a wholesale transformation in its pedagogical approach to fighter combat. The freshly minted curriculum implemented at Jacksonville and subsequently adopted across other vital training installations heralded a profound, indeed complete, philosophical reorientation in fighter pilot education. Aspiring aviators were now rigorously instructed in the intricate principles of energy management as a foundational concept, prior to even delving into the complexities of advanced aerobatics. Instructors, embracing innovative pedagogical techniques, frequently employed vivid classroom physics demonstrations to illuminate the fundamental concepts of kinetic and potential energy. A particularly impactful teaching method involved the simple yet effective act of rolling balls down ramps of varying elevations. Through this tangible visual aid, students could viscerally grasp how a ball commencing its descent from a greater height, imbued with more potential energy, would consequently strike with greater force and traverse a longer distance, indicative of superior kinetic energy compared to a ball starting from a lower position. The underlying message, distilled to its essence, was elegantly straightforward. Superior altitude directly equated to superior energy, and superior energy, in turn, equated to sustained life in aerial combat. The pilot who initiated an engagement from a position of greater elevation inherently commanded and controlled the trajectory of the fight. The mastery of throttle discipline was elevated to a distinct and critical training module within this reformed curriculum. Student pilots were thrust into highly realistic practice engagements, wherein experienced instructors flying swifter aircraft would deliberately position themselves squarely on their tail, meticulously simulating the relentless pursuit of an enemy zero attack. Under this simulated pressure, the students were compelled to execute precise throttle-down maneuvers, all while meticulously maintaining absolute control over their aircraft. The crucial element involved perfectly timing the deceleration to induce the pursuing instructor to overshoot their target, thereby creating a fleeting window of opportunity for the student to recover swiftly and seamlessly transition from a defensive posture to an offensive one. This regimen was, by all accounts, intensely nerve-wracking. The instinctive act of reducing engine power with an aggressor aircraft glued to one's tail felt profoundly counterintuitive, even suicidal, to the uninitiated. Nevertheless, it was precisely this high-stress simulation that indelibly forged the essential muscle memory and cultivated the unwavering confidence indispensable for executing this life-saving technique under the harrowing duress of actual combat. Instructors meticulously observed and documented that students who demonstrated a comprehensive mastery of throttle management during these rigorous training exercises subsequently exhibited significantly enhanced survival rates during their initial 3 combat missions, a period universally recognized as the most perilously vulnerable for inexperienced aviators. The seminal Fighter Tactics Manual officially released in May 1943, served as the definitive codification of the invaluable lessons and empirically derived strategies that Pacific veterans had painstakingly unearthed through their combat experiences. This groundbreaking manual unequivocally stipulated that pilots were to assiduously avoid engaging Japanese fighters in protracted turning contests, a direct repudiation of prior doctrine. Furthermore, it furnished precise recommendations regarding optimal altitude and airspeed parameters tailored for a diverse array of tactical scenarios. The manual meticulously detailed the celebrated thatch weave, complete with illustrative diagrams that clearly delineated crucial crossing angles and precise timing sequences. Critically, and in a radical departure from conventional military instruction, it elucidated the fundamental why underpinning each recommended tactic. It went beyond merely dictating what actions to take, delving instead into the underlying physics and even the psychological principles that rendered these techniques so remarkably effective. This comprehensive approach represented a truly revolutionary advancement in military doctrine, which had historically been content to issue commands without providing extensive explanatory context for its soldiers. Beyond the mechanical execution of maneuvers, the enhanced training regimen placed an equally profound emphasis on the critical faculties of immediate recognition and decisive decision-making under intense pressure. Student pilots were rigorously drilled to instantly identify aircraft silhouettes and to accurately assess complex tactical situations within mere seconds. A series of fundamental questions. Is that enemy aircraft positioned above or below you? What is your relative speed compared to the adversary? Do you possess an energy advantage in this specific moment? Can you safely disengage if the engagement begins to unfold unfavorably? Were ingrained to become automatic, processed by the aviator's mind faster than conscious deliberation. To cultivate this rapid cognitive processing, instructors ingeniously devised and implemented high-pressure scenarios during training flights. These simulations encompassed a spectrum of challenges, from sudden simulated emergencies and engagements against multiple attackers to critical low-fuel situations, all meticulously crafted to compel students to make split-second, life-or-death decisions while concurrently maintaining vigilant management of their aircraft's vital energy state. In a parallel and equally vital initiative, the Marine Corps established its own analogous training pipeline at Marine Corps Air Station El Centro, nestled within California's arid Imperial Valley. Marine instructors, many of whom were hardened veterans, forged in the brutal aerial battles over Guadalcanal, infused an even more aggressive and uncompromising edge into the burgeoning energy-fighting doctrine. They unequivocally underscored that the disciplined maintenance of superior altitude demanded an almost excruciating degree of patience. Inexperienced new pilots, often driven by an eagerness to engage, frequently exhibited an impetuous desire to immediately dive upon every perceived target, thereby prematurely squandering their crucial energy advantage on shots with inherently low probabilities of success. In contrast, the seasoned veterans meticulously imparted the wisdom of restraint. They taught their charges to wait, to patiently stalk their quarry, and to meticulously position themselves with such consummate precision and stealth that the enemy remained utterly oblivious to the impending attack, until the very moment American bullets began to tear through their airframes. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Indian Joe Bauer, a revered Medal of Honor recipient, and an undisputed veteran of the harrowing Guadalcanal campaign, frequently imparted a blunt yet profound philosophy to his eager students. His words cut through any romanticized notions of aerial combat, stating with unwavering conviction, "The successful fighter pilot is patient, calculating, and ruthless. Gallantry is for movies, efficiency is for survival." This stark declaration encapsulated the core tenets of the new doctrine, emphasizing cold, strategic effectiveness over impulsive, heroic gestures, firmly establishing the true pathway to success and longevity in the unforgiving skies. By the middle of 1943, an extraordinary transformation had occurred. Virtually every fighter pilot graduating from the rigorous training programs of both the Navy and Marine Corps had been comprehensively and thoroughly indoctrinated in the nuances of energy tactics and the critical skill of throttle management. They had diligently practiced the intricate thatch weave until its execution became an almost reflexive action, performable even in a state of semi-consciousness. They had endured countless forced overshoot drills, pushing their limits until the act of judiciously reducing throttle in a defensive situation felt instinctively natural, rather than a terrifying, counterintuitive impulse. Crucially, they grasped with undeniable clarity that their robust wildcats, powerful corsairs, or formidable hellcats simply could not outturn an agile Zero in a close-quarters dogfight, and therefore they would never attempt such a futile maneuver. This widespread standardized training instilled a profound confidence, meaning that seasoned squadron commanders in the Pacific could now implicitly trust that replacement pilots arriving in the theater already possessed a fundamental, deeply ingrained understanding of how to effectively fight and, more importantly, how to survive in the unforgiving realm of aerial combat. The tangible outcomes unequivocally validated the substantial investment made in this pioneering training methodology. Throughout the latter half of 1943, as a steady stream of comprehensively trained pilots poured into the Pacific squadrons, the American fighter-kill ratios against Japanese aircraft soared dramatically, consistently climbing beyond an impressive 5-to-1 and continuing their upward trajectory. Significantly, these exceptional statistics were not solely the exclusive domain of a handful of legendary veteran aces. Rather, they were achieved by average pilots, meticulously applying the systematic and highly effective tactics they had assiduously learned during their training. The invaluable institutional knowledge, which had been largely confined to the personal experiences of combat veterans in early 1943, had, by the close of the year, been successfully transformed into a standard, pervasive competency across the entirety of the American fighter force. The humble throttle lever, once perceived merely as a rudimentary control for adjusting speed, had been fundamentally re-envisioned and transformed into a sophisticated tactical weapon, a tool that every American fighter pilot now instinctively understood how to expertly employ for decisive advantage. Ultimately, the innovative throttle-down overshoot technique and the expansive energy fighting doctrine, it so powerfully epitomized, transcended the realm of mere clever aerial tactics. They represented something far more profound. These developments served as a compelling demonstration of how American military culture, when galvanized by appropriate motivation and confronted with pressing challenges, possessed an exceptional capacity to systematically dissect complex problems, rapidly adapt to the formidable strengths of its adversaries, and swiftly forge ingenious solutions often at a pace that outstripped the enemy's ability to counter-adapt. While the Japanese military had dedicated the entire decade of the 1930s to meticulously perfecting the formidable Zero fighter and painstakingly training an elite cadre of naval aviators to ruthlessly exploit its unparalleled capabilities, the Americans, in a remarkable feat of strategic agility, spent a mere 6 months in 1942 deciphering how to effectively neutralize a full decade of Japanese investment. They then proceeded to institutionalize that hard-won knowledge across thousands of pilots with astonishing efficiency. This profound adaptability fostered a compounding strategic advantage, one that extended its influence far beyond the fleeting outcomes of individual dogfights, reshaping the very landscape of aerial warfare. The intense aerial engagements of World War II transcended mere individual aerial combat. By the latter half of 1943, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Arm found itself ensnared in a devastating and irreversible downward spiral. Their most skilled aviators, the seasoned warriors who had commanded the skies during the initial stages of the conflict, had largely perished, shot down by Allied pilots who had, through bitter experience, discovered the folly of engaging the Japanese on their own terms. Successive waves of replacement pilots received drastically curtailed training, a direct consequence of Japan's critical shortages in aviation fuel, limited available time, and the scarcity of secure airspace conducive to comprehensive aviator development. These green, unseasoned pilots were tasked with flying the very same A-6M Zero fighters that had once instilled terror across the Pacific theater in 1942. Yet they lacked the crucial guidance of veteran leadership and were pitted against American pilots who had been rigorously and systematically drilled in advanced tactical doctrines specifically engineered to exploit the Zero's inherent vulnerabilities. The fundamental design of the aircraft had not undergone significant alteration. Rather, it was the precipitous decline in the caliber of the pilots operating them that proved catastrophic. This dramatic shift in aerial superiority was starkly and tragically illuminated during the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, which unfolded over June 19th and 20th, 1944. American carrier-based fighter squadrons, now predominantly equipped with the formidable F-6F Hellcats, aircraft that seamlessly merge the robust durability of the earlier Wildcat with substantially enhanced performance characteristics, decisively intercepted colossal Japanese strike formations throughout the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The American aviators meticulously adhered to strict altitude discipline, expertly leveraged energy tactics, and judiciously employed throttle management whenever the situation demanded. Over the course of those 2 harrowing days, the Japanese suffered the catastrophic loss of approximately 600 aircraft, while American casualties amounted to a mere 120, with the vast majority of these attributable to operational mishaps rather than direct combat engagements. This engagement resulted in a kill ratio exceeding an astonishing 10-1, a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never recover. It became unequivocally clear that the Zero itself had not inherently become obsolete. Instead, the sophisticated tactics required to effectively counter and defeat it had become universally understood and applied by Allied forces. The sophisticated intellectual framework that gave rise to the ingenious throttle-down tactics resonated far beyond the confines of fighter aviation, profoundly influencing American military thought across numerous domains. This identical analytical methodology which entailed thoroughly scrutinizing the adversary's strengths, meticulously identifying the foundational assumptions underpinning those perceived advantages, and subsequently devising innovative tactics designed to invalidate those very assumptions, manifested itself across a multitude of military branches. Submarine commanders, for instance, diligently studied Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, subsequently developing audacious new tactics specifically tailored to exploit its inherent weaknesses and gaps. Similarly, bomber formations meticulously analyzed enemy fighter attack patterns, then strategically modified their defensive arrangements to enhance their survivability. In essence, the entire military apparatus transformed into a highly adaptive learning organization, one that no longer perceived enemy capabilities as immutable obstacles, but rather as intricate problems to be systematically dissected and resolved through rigorous analytical processes and daring tactical innovation. We sincerely invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video. We would be truly grateful for your like and subscription. Please also share a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how the throttle technique powerfully exemplified the profound rewards awaiting those who dared to question deeply ingrained assumptions and courageously challenged conventional wisdom. Traditional fighter doctrine, for generations, dictated that aerial combat was primarily won through agile turning and intricate maneuvering. Every primal instinct of a pilot facing an adversary on their tail screamed for an immediate increase in speed, not a reduction. The very notion of deliberately decelerating when an enemy aircraft was locked in pursuit seemed utterly insane until a handful of pilots, either desperate enough to try anything or creative enough to envision the impossible, discovered that such apparent madness occasionally yielded far superior results than conventional sanity. The legendary Jimmy Thatch, painstakingly pushing matchsticks across his desk to simulate aerial maneuvers, or Marion Carl, audaciously chopping his throttle with a zero hot on his six, or John Smith rigorously drilling his pilots never to engage in turning fights. These were not merely acts of martial genius. They were, fundamentally, acts of profound intellectual courage, a resolute willingness to experiment with radically different approaches. When established, conventional methods were consistently resulting in devastating losses. The Japanese, conversely, conspicuously failed to cultivate an equivalent capacity for adaptive innovation throughout the entire Pacific War. The iconic Zero fighter, despite American tactics rendering its early advantages increasingly irrelevant and its combat effectiveness severely diminished, remained fundamentally unchanged in its design and capabilities from 1942 all the way through 1945. Simultaneously, Japanese training doctrine stubbornly continued to emphasize individual pilot skill and aggressive, head-on engagement, even as the quality of their pilot corps suffered a catastrophic and irreversible decline. Crucially, when American pilots successfully developed and mastered throttle discipline and energy management techniques, they systematically disseminated this invaluable knowledge throughout their ranks, ensuring widespread adoption. In stark contrast, while some Japanese pilots undeniably managed to devise ingenious techniques to counter American tactics, this vital knowledge rarely, if ever, transcended the boundaries of individual units. The very organizational culture that had initially fostered the Zero unparalleled excellence proved tragically incapable of adapting when that excellence, once sufficient, became demonstrably inadequate against evolving Allied strategies. The profound tactical evolution that commenced with American pilots desperately striving to survive encounters with the formidable Zeros established enduring patterns that would come to define American air combat doctrine not only through the nascent jet age, but for decades beyond. Pilots flying the F-86 Sabres against the swift MiG-15s during the Korean War instinctively employed energy tactics and precise throttle management, strategies directly derived from the hard-won experiences of World War II. Later, Vietnam-era fighter pilots who, regrettably, had largely forgotten these critical lessons and attempted to engage agile MiG-17s in cumbersome F-4 Phantoms through traditional turn fighting, relearned them at immense and painful cost. This arduous relearning process ultimately precipitated the establishment of foundational institutions like Top Gun and other advanced fighter training programs, which vehemently re-emphasized the core energy fighting principles first developed over the skies of Guadalcanal. Even today, modern fighter pilots are rigorously instructed in concepts such as energy states, overshoot mechanics, and the paramount importance of controlling engagement geometry, fundamental principles that would be immediately comprehensible and recognizable to pioneers like Jimmy Thatch or Marion Carl. The throttle lever itself, a ubiquitous control present in every cockpit, became a powerful symbol of this broader tactical transformation. It was perpetually there, a seemingly simple mechanical device that every pilot manipulated dozens of times during a single flight. Yet paradoxically, no one truly conceived of it as a weapon until dire circumstances unequivocally compelled such creative re-evaluation. This then constitutes the essential overarching lesson. The very tools required to resolve complex problems frequently already exist within our grasp. What is truly demanded is the visionary insight to perceive familiar objects in entirely unfamiliar ways, the profound courage to embark upon unconventional approaches, and the rigorous discipline to systematically teach and ingrain what demonstrably proves effective. American fighter pilots in 1942 did not idly await the arrival of superior aircraft to overcome the Zero's initial dominance. Instead, they ingeniously utilized the aircraft they possessed, harnessed the immutable laws of physics that governed all flight, and tapped into the boundless creativity that sheer desperation often unlocks. They deliberately pulled the throttle back when every ingrained instinct clamored to push it forward. In doing so, they fundamentally transformed the hunters into the hunted, effectively rendering Japan's most formidable aerial weapon an obsolete relic, and irrefutably demonstrated that relentless adaptation invariably triumphs over perfection when that perfection proves incapable of evolving. The confident Zero pilots who committed to pursuit, fully anticipating yet another effortless victory, instead found themselves catastrophically overshooting their targets, suddenly and terrifyingly vulnerable in the final, fleeting seconds they would ever experience. The throttle had, in its silent, decisive action, emphatically spoken.